great thinkers and great wanderers like Don and like Diane and like many in this group that I know are explorers. What brought this class on is a conversation that Don and I have been having somewhat regularly. And part of what happens is that we end up talking, and then we end up talking more, and then we look at our watch and realize that 2 hours has passed. And then we say, wow, we need to do this again. And then we started talking about how we can do this, share some of these things together. I guess if I were to say as a priest, what might be a way that I think about how this fits, this conversation unfolds in our space, is to use some of the words of theologian, Roman Catholic theologian and Franciscan nun, Ilia Delio. One of the things that she talks about is that in many ways, the church has continued to live in a theological framework, a philosophical framework, that was largely conceived and developed in what we might call a pre-Copernican world, a world where the thinking and the understanding of humanity was that humanity is the center of all creation, we're the most dominant thing on the face of the earth, and that the earth is the center of all the universe, and that everything revolves around the earth, and human beings are the biggest thing on the earth, so it's all about us, and everything revolves around us. That's much of the language in which many of our theological frameworks have been developed. And when we say theological frameworks, I mean philosophies, but also liturgies and all that kind of stuff. What would it look like if we started to maybe catch up a little bit to what we now know to be true in the scientific world and in the world as we're discovering it, that we're not the center of the universe and the earth, and that we're not only in one universe, that there's multiple solar systems and bigger universes. And as we continue to look and probe beyond, we realize that we're actually a very, very small, very, very tiny piece of a vast mystery. And what would it look like if we were to open ourselves theologically, spiritually, to that reality? As you've heard the term quantum spirituality, the idea of quantum physics is now accepted in the scientific world, but our theological world hasn't caught up to the ideas of quantum physics yet. We're still kind of talking about another kind of physics. So out of those questions and wanderings, this conversation has begun, and I'm crazy about what Don does, I'm crazy about what Diane does, I'm crazy about the ways in which you all continue to explore. My deepest hope is that this is not a class. My deepest hope is that this is not a class where you open up your head or your notebooks, you write things down, and you walk away and say, oh, there we go. Yeah. My deepest hope is that this is the beginning of a conversation, and multiple conversations. And let me say this, it's okay if part of that conversation is an internal argument. It's okay if that argument becomes external and you say to yourself or to others, but what about this? But what about this? Because this is discovery we're doing here, and discovery does not come without struggle. So let's do that work together, and let's be grateful for Don, your work, in helping us into that struggle, and let's see where this takes us. Is that good?
Thank you, Jonathan.
I'm going to say a prayer, but I'm not going to say a prayer. Let's just be the prayer. Let's just hold a moment of silence as we open ourselves to whatever unfolds in the coming seconds and minutes. So the Lord be with you. And let's hold a moment of reverent silence as we open ourselves.
So I'm so happy to see all of you here. This is the first of 5 meetings, and the full title of this is Quantum Spirituality, Evolving Your Relationship with the Universe. Diane and I were lucky enough to have an incredible spiritual teacher, Pir Vilayat, in the Sufi group that we belonged to for 25 years. And he would talk about how the word God had become so laden with baggage, misconceptions, and so on. So he preferred, instead of saying God, to say universe with a capital U. So, back in ancient days, thousands of years ago, the yogis, you could say, maybe were the earliest scientists, and they didn't have laboratories, they didn't have external equipment, but they did research on themselves by tuning in and discovered all kinds of things about subtle energy centers, chakras, pathways of subtle energy, and so on. And over the centuries, spirituality has generally, the notions of God have been based on the scientific understanding at the time, as Jonathan was mentioning. And so the ancient Greeks had this idyllic model of the universe and perfect symmetry and circle patterns and so on. And then time goes by and here comes Copernicus discovering that the Earth is not the center of the solar system and so on. And then Galileo, and then the persecution of Galileo because it was contrary to church doctrine. And the Newton comes along with a clockwork model of the universe, which we still very much live in, not just in religion, but in most people's way of viewing themselves and their relationship to the world. And so what do I mean by that? For one, it is dualistic. Dualistic meaning that you can pull yourself out, if you're a scientist, and study something, not have any impact on it. And if you do enough studying, you can understand. In Newton's time, it was thought that eventually, if you could understand the location of every particle and its momentum, then you could trace what had ever happened in the past and everything that was going to happen in the future. It's kind of the billiard ball model of the universe. But it's a separated notion, and it very much led to a separated notion of humanity and God. God was viewed as being in some transcendent realm who, in different religions and spiritual systems, either had no involvement in creation or had an involvement, and over time the notions of God evolved from a very judgmental one to the teachings of Christ, a very loving one and so on, but still generally experienced by people as something separated from us. And the viewpoint of existence in different traditions. In Hinduism, you may be familiar with the term Maya. It's referred to as the dance of God. Like, this manifestation is really just an illusion. It's all God, or it's the dream of God, and it just goes back to the one, and there's cycles of existence, and it starts all over again from scratch. In other traditions, in Buddhism, there's no such thing as a separate self, and the idea is to free oneself from the illusion of being a self and then to enter into a state of nirvana where there's no longer any personal identity. And the same is generally true of yoga. The aim is to enter the highest state, is called nirvikalpa samadhi, which means without seed. And that means your consciousness is totally merged into an infinite ocean of bliss, and there's no you anymore, and it's forever and ever. You might think, oh, that sounds pretty good. But then it raises a question. Jonathan referred to the hope that this will generate questions. Well, one question would be, what's the point of having an existence if the point is just to go back to where it started? And what's the point of having individuals if the point is to get rid of individuality and just merge back into the ocean that you started from? So I like to inject humor a lot of times in what I share when I'm presenting. So one notion is someone dies and they go back to God, and God says, well, what have you done with your life? He said, well, God, you'd be very pleased to know I've been studying flowers all my life, and I've separated them into their different chemical elements, and I've written out all the equations for them, so here you go. And God said, that's not why I created flowers, or you, for that matter. The point was to further something. Mm-hmm. And so in the teachings of the Sufis, the emphasis, in contrast to Buddhism and Hinduism, is a furtherance of divinity in life. It's that there's an evolutionary purpose to existence. It's not to go back to some pre-established state. It's not to, and even, I grew up Jewish, and had I been exposed to the Kabbalah growing up, I might be a rabbi now, but I never was till later. But one of the notions in mystical Judaism is in the original creation, light descended to form creation and then it shattered into pieces. And so the aim and purpose of humanity is to recollect the broken shards and restore them to how they were. And I thought, well, that doesn't sit quite right to me. I think the purpose is to take the uniqueness of those different aspects of light and create something that was never there before. So the Sufis talk about creation began because God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known, to love, and to be loved, and that could only take place through there being a manifestation, and it could only take place through there being conscious beings that could establish a relationship with what we think of as God, with the transcendent, and out of that relationship is born wisdom that what we think of God could never know without that relationship. And furthermore, that wisdom wasn't something just sitting there in the Akashic records. That wisdom was actually created in the process of that relationship uniquely through each person. So, how does this tie in with this notion, this is about quantum spirituality? What does quantum physics have to do with spirituality? Well, science has discovered over the past very many years what the mystics have been saying for thousands of years, that everything is deeply interconnected with everything else. And furthermore, everything has an impact all the time on everything else that's non-local in nature. So what does that mean? It doesn't depend on space or time. So something can have an effect here on something at the other end of the universe instantaneously. Well, that's already pretty mind-boggling, and there have been experiments to show that. They've done experiments with light that comes from distant stars that's become entangled with photons, and they make a change in one end of it, and it changes the other side, even though they're light years apart. Pretty cool. But you also get, they've done experiments to show that you can have a particle that was created in the past that becomes entangled. It's in a relationship with something that exists in the present, and then one of those can be destroyed and they're still in effect. The future can change the past. So we think of time in a Newtonian way. It's the arrow of time. It's just progressing from now to the next instant to the next instant. But everything is impacting everything else in all times. That's pretty mind-boggling. And there's all kinds of implications with that. One is that there can be a healing brought about to the past, and that doesn't mean you're literally going to undo some accident that took place, but some effect can take place across time. Effects can take place across space. Well, anyone who's religious and spiritual knows that that's how prayer works. It's not like you're sitting here broadcasting a signal that's got to travel through space and get to so-and-so. It's instantaneous, and the effect can be very powerful. So there have been many, I really feel like the parables of our time now are mind-boggling results of science that compel you, if you're open-minded and you believe the data from experiments that have been replicated, that the universe we live in is not the way that we think it is. So let me share a couple of science stories, because I love these. One of them, and don't ask me how this person got funding, it was a French researcher, and he invented just a little, he made a little machine that was controlled by a computer, and it just generated random numbers, but depending on the number that it generated, it would either go forward, back, left, or right. And so he imprinted some newly hatched chickens with this. Well, this isn't that remarkable. The chickens thought the robot was their mother and it followed it around. But then he put the chickens in the corner of a room, put chicken wire around them so they couldn't get out, put this random number-generated robot in the middle, and it should just walk like a drunk walk all over the place. But the robot spent significantly more time in the corner where the chickens are than the rest of the room. So you go, what are the possibilities of this? Either chickens have psychic powers and they can influence the computer, or the robot has consciousness and wanted to be around its babies. Well, who knows? Maybe there's other possibilities. But something's going on that shouldn't happen ordinarily. What does ordinarily mean? By our assumptions, what the laws of the universe are. So we talk about religions being dogmatic, and certainly they can be in just rigid, fixed beliefs, but there's a notion of fundamentalist scientists. And that means scientists that are so convinced that what they consider is immutable laws, for instance, of physics, that that's just the way that things are, and any experiment that contradicts that either wasn't done right or it's New Age mumbo-jumbo and has no bearing on reality. Well, there's a physicist or a scientist, retired professor emeritus from Stanford named William Tiller, who researched subtle energy for decades. And one of his most famous experiments was he took like a little bit of circuitry. So imagine you have a dead computer, you take out the motherboard and you cut out a couple square inches of it and you put it in the middle of a table, and you bring 3 of your fellow meditating friends, you sit around the table, and their instructions are, see if you can store an intention in this circuitry such that when we put it in a laboratory somewhere else in the world, it will raise the pH of water in a beaker that it has no physical contact with 1 point up. You know, if somebody told you this, you'd think, this is crazy. I mean, it's not connected, and even if it was, how is this going to raise the pH? But lo and behold, this has been replicated many times. And if the intention is for the pH to go down 1 point, that's what happens. And furthermore, the way that heat is distributed in the room is contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, which is disorder is always increasing. And actually, order increased in those laboratories in the way heat was distributed. Impossible from ordinary physics. So Diane and I got to hear William Tiller present at a conference we went to, and he recounted a time when he was on a panel with a very distinguished traditional physicist, and Tiller shares his research. And the conventional physicist, who is very famous, turns to Tiller and says, even if what you're saying is true, I don't believe it. So, you know, we get so locked into our assumptions of what reality is that we can literally not see anything that contradicts that. And I wish I had the equipment here to show you this, but Harvard did a little study. They made a video of 2 groups of people with a basketball, and some were white shirts, some were black shirts, and the ones with white shirts are bouncing the ball to another white shirt. And your job is just to count how many times the ball is passed in 1 minute. Okay. At the end, you put in your answer. Then the instructions are, go back and look at it again. Don't worry about counting, but see if you missed anything. And I must say, I missed this, and almost everybody that looks at this misses it. In the background, on the back wall, the whole time this is going on, there's a man in a gorilla suit going back and forth beating his chest. And I didn't see it. Why didn't I see it? Because my brain has no expectation that Harvard's going to insert something so ridiculous into their little scientific study, and just literally blind to something right in front of us. Okay. Well, we have a kind of blindness in our way of perceiving the world. We assume, and we don't take it as an assumption, we think, well, it must be the reality that the world is what we can perceive with our physical senses. And an extension of that is scientists saying, if I can't measure it, it's not real. Okay, but let's just stick to the first part. Well, we know that there are birds that can see ultraviolet light. There are animals that can hear infrasonic and ultrasonic sounds that we can't hear. There's some kind of, I think it's a shrimp that, you know, in our eyes we've got 3 different kinds of cones, that, red, blue, and green, but these shrimp have something like 20 different colors. And you can imagine what the world must look like to those shrimp compared to what we see. And we think the world is the way that it is. And so we grow up, we're conditioned in our beliefs, whether they're scientific ones or religious ones, we're conditioned to what we've been taught and assumptions. So we're conditioned to notions about what we think God is. And for most people, the notion of God is something separate from us that we certainly want to have a relationship with. We certainly want to experience it, but we can't imagine ourselves being deeply interconnected with what we think of as God. Ibn Arabi, who was, I think, one of the greatest mystics that ever been, a Sufi mystic in the 1200s, I believe, said that humans exist in a relationship of bi-unity, bi-unity. We are human divine beings. And then he says some really amazing things. He says neither side of that relationship can exist without the other side. And even more astounding, he says each side is the creator of the other side. Our human side creates what we think of as God. The God side creates what we think of as ourselves. And furthermore, the purpose of existence is what can be unfolded by that relationship. So, in this series, we're going to be talking about, I mentioned part of the title is Evolving Your Relationship with the Universe. We're going to be talking about everything being in terms of relationship. We can only know through our relationship with what we are experiencing. But what we do is we have an experience. We could have a direct experience of something. But then our tendency is to pull back from the direct experience and conceptualize it. Isn't that flower pretty? Wasn't that really nice? I like this person. I don't like this person. Just any number of thoughts, our reaction to the circumstance, and then our thoughts that we feed into that prevent us from really experiencing things the way they are. So if you can remember back to when you were a little kid, maybe you can, if you can't remember a whole lot, maybe you can remember that everything seems so magical. And nobody has to teach little kids how to experience things as magical. They are in this state of deep interconnectedness. And I remember growing up, I must have been 4 years old one day when it just hit me that I can think about things. And I thought that was so cool, and it is. I mean, I could actually think about what I was experiencing. But before then, that thought never occurred. It was just really the direct experience, and there wasn't like hanging on to thinking about what had happened yesterday. It's a really wonderful state to be in. However, there's a wisdom that we hope accrues from growing up, and we'd like to be able to be in that state with the wisdom that we've gained over the ages. So we're not just kind of a blank slate having an experience. Well, again, now let's put some more tie-ins to science here. There's a famous experiment called the two-slit experiment. So if you have, let's say, a board and it just has one slit, and you shoot photons one at a time through it, and you have a photographic plate on the other side, you're going to get like what you'd expect if you shined a flashlight through. It'll be a disk of light. If you put two slits, and you just send the photon through the one on the right, you think, well, I'm going to get the same thing. Nope. You get alternating light and dark bands. And what's happening is somehow this photon is behaving as a wave as well as a particle, and the photon is interfering with itself, even though you're only doing them one at a time. It's like, huh? Okay, that's pretty cool already, and that's still pretty mysterious, but IONS, the Institute of Noetic Science, did an experiment where they set up the two-slit experiment in a lab, and then they had two groups, experienced meditators and people that never had meditated at a different location. And they asked the meditators to imagine that they could witness the photons going through the slit, and the other group, they gave the same instruction. Well, what happened, the meditators actually, it's called collapsing the quantum wave function. You can't cheat nature. It generated a pattern that would have happened if someone's standing in the lab looking at it, or if you had a device that measured the photon as it went through, but not the ones that weren't experienced meditators. So what does this mean? Consciousness is having an impact on energy. So many physicists now are seriously postulating that more fundamental than energy is consciousness. That consciousness is fundamental. And then even more now, some people are saying information, but it's not information the way we usually think about it, like a bunch of data. And I don't want to go into detail about that, but let's just stick with consciousness. Consciousness has an impact on something that you are measuring. In fact, it's impossible to have a measurement that consciousness is not going to have an impact on. And some kinds of measurements, it's going to be much more than other kinds of measurements. So another little study. Diane and I met this man named Roger Penrose, who used to work at Princeton, and they had a laboratory in their engineering department that did kind of far out stuff. And they worked with random number generators, which isn't that far out. The little computer that's just generating random numbers, storing the data. So let's pretend I bring one of you into the lab and sit you down and say, see if you can change the output of this random number generator so it deviates significantly from being random. And lo and behold, most people could do this. How do they do it? Beats the heck out of me, but it happened. So consciousness changed the output of this computer. Well, that's not supposed to be happening by physics. Okay. Now listen to this one. I generated data yesterday and bring one of you in today and say, oh, and nobody's looked at yesterday's. It hasn't been printed. No one's looked at it. And I say, see if you can change yesterday's data between 2 and 3 in the afternoon so it's no longer random. And then lo and behold, then they print it out and analyze it. That'll be the only time yesterday that the data is not random. But wait a minute, it was already there before you came into the lab and tried to change it. What is going on here? Well, this is a phenomenon called retrocausality. Something in the present can change something in the past. However, if it had been printed out, and even if someone had just looked at the printout and didn't analyze it, it wouldn't change. It collapses the function. But if nobody's looked at it, it's in this state of multiple possibilities that our consciousness causes to change to one or the other. You may have heard about Schrodinger's cat. I think they're trying to make that more humane where the cat doesn't get poisoned. In fact, I thought about closing the door here so you couldn't get in and having a way to broadcast out there, and you're trying to get in. And so I would say to you while you're out there, welcome to Schrodinger's presentation, and until you open the door, you won't know who's going to present it, either Father Jonathan or me. It's uncertain. So here we are. So I love reading about things that are being discovered in science because I think they really have an impact on understanding spirituality and vice versa. And one of my main meditation practices, I would say now for decades, has been to sit with a question. And the question might be based on something I've read about in science and wondering how that applies to spirituality or vice versa. And I'll always get an answer, not necessarily immediately. It might be 3 weeks later, out of the blue, something comes. But the person that brought Sufism to the West in the early 1900s is named Hazrat Inayat Khan. And he said something that there can't be two truths, one for science and one for mysticism. There can only be one truth, but there's different ways and different language that people use to describe this one reality. And furthermore, quantum physics says that if two particles have the identical quantum state, they can't be, there can only be one. It's unique. And Ibn Arabi, that I mentioned earlier, said that every human being has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other human ever could have access to. And then furthermore, and this is in the 1200s, and I think this was very nervy for him to say, because if someone said this today, you'd have to worry about people coming and trying to chop your head off. He said that God told the Prophet Muhammad that he needed to learn from his followers because each of them had access to a part of the divine wisdom that he couldn't have access to. So I used to think that when I began my quest for spirituality, which started in high school, that I wanted to be like the Buddha. I wanted to be enlightened like the Buddha, because the Buddha surely knew everything. He was fully enlightened. You know, he had visions of all his past lives and all the different realms of reality and so on. But I've come to realize that the Buddha, in his enlightenment, was able to know everything that the Buddha was able to know at that point in time, but there are things that I can discover that the Buddha couldn't know, and that's true for every one of you. Enlightenment is not a generic thing that, you know, you get there and you cross the finish line. And furthermore, it's not a destination. There's not an end point to it. Because if there was an end point to it, there could be no further evolution to anything. And so what that says to me, if there was an end point to everything, then God would no longer be a living God, emergent, discovering. And so some notions that we've had over the centuries about what God is about. God is omniscient. God knows everything. I think from, unless God is violating the rules of the universe that God created, quantum physics, God couldn't possibly know everything, because things arise in a space of possibilities that's indeterminate until it happens. So there could never be just this fixed body of information that, you know, us lowly beings in creation are trying to get to. Revelation, I used to think of revelation as a discovery of something that's sitting somewhere, that's already there, you know, waiting for us to be able to access it. But I believe that revelation is something that is emergent and is created in the relationship of the experience, and each of us is capable of discovering different kinds of revelations that nobody else can possibly discover. So let me pause here, because I've given you some big chunks here, and as Father Jonathan said, you know, we want this to be something that stimulates you to thinking. So I'd like to see if you have questions.
And the people leaving are the choir members, by the way. Just letting y'all know. Because they got to get ready for church, not because they're leaving.
Right.
Okay, good.
So does anybody have any questions or comments so far, or do you have anything that you want to add to what I've said so far?
Well, I think one of the great questions, for me at least, as a lifelong church geek, is how far can you push at the exploration that we're doing and remain what I think many people are concerned about is consider themselves as Christian, right? How far can this go? So one thing I would say is keep going. There is a perception in Western Christianity. When I say Western Christianity, I mean Christianity primarily from Western European and then the colonial areas of Christianity, so that's us, that says it's important for us to stay inside a certain set of boxes. And we probably know enough of our history to know that some of those boxes have names. Some of those names include the church, or the Roman Catholic Church, or the Protestant Church. And all of those names are important, and they indicate a lot of different fidelities and a lot of different relationships. But there always has been, in all of Christianity, a vast body of work that would be broadly called mysticism. And that broad and deep tradition is often not talked about a whole lot when it comes to identifying yourself within a certain body of Christianity, right? So if you feel like, as a person who might have a name associated with you in your Christianity, and that this is maybe making you a little itchy, it might be because it's unfamiliar, but I would just encourage us all to say that mysticism has always opened that itchy, uncomfortable part of us. And when I say mysticism, I mean the classical definition of mysticism, which is that religion is not a distant experience or a distant set of precepts, but it is a lived and physical, incarnate in this space experience from which we're trying to discover greater meaning and greater content. That mysticism says that, as you said, Don, that the divine is not distant and we're aligning ourselves with a certain set of instructions. Mysticism classically posits that the divine is actually more close than we probably are really ever comfortable with, more close than we can ever imagine, that the divine might be right here, that God's own presence might be radically in this space, and whether we want it to be or not. That's not that's an isness, not a, okay, I agree with that ness. Does that make sense? That God's presence is not distant. And I think that aligns a lot of what you're talking about, as we've discussed, about Sufism, that same idea that this mystery, this vast mystery, is not ours to take ourselves away from our regular life and then wander ourselves into somewhere out there. That vast mystery is right here. The entirety of that mystery, of that wondering, is right here in our own lives, not something that we take ourselves out of our lives to get into. I think that invitation is pretty compelling. I will say this as well. There's a reason why many Western Christian traditions are concerned often about mysticism, which is that it invites people to consider life outside the box. And life outside the box is hard to manage and control. And there's always a part of our religious life that wants to manage and control things. So that's part of what I would kind of say as well as going on here is that you can explore as a faithful Christian well beyond the box and remain a faithful Christian. And I would say keep going. Keep that wondering going. My question for you is, Don, is when you talk about, and there's so many great things, and this is what we kind of do. When you talk about God, when we're talking about God, or what is it you were talking about? Is there more language that maybe we're not using when we talk about God? Like, are we talking about a consciousness? Are we talking about a singularity or a multiplicity? Or when we say God, what is that? How do you talk about that? Maybe that might be.
Okay, well, that is a wonderful question. I'd like to refer to a metaphor that Hazrat Khan used to talk about God and souls. So he said, God is like a divine central sun, S-U-N, and each of our souls is like a ray of light emanating from that. And each of our souls has descended through all the realms, the angelic realm, the jinn realm, all the way to physical manifestation. And just like the map said, a rest stop says you are here, we think we're here, but that's it. This is all me, and God's something way up there, distant and separated. But actually, we're the entirety of that whole ray. And each of us has a unique plug-in, so to speak, with that transcendent mystery that's beyond any words. And even Arabi talked about the corporate God of religion, and he wasn't being critical of religions, but it's kind of like the generic Allah in Islam, or just the way God is described in Judaism or Christianity, like it's just this one thing. And then he would talk about the personal Lord. And the personal Lord is our unique way of experiencing the divine. Like if we could open up our relationship with the rest of that ray, even if we don't quite realize it as really being ourselves, but there's this deep connection. It's our way of relating to our unique way of experiencing the divine. And that's different for each person, and it certainly changes over the course of our life. And it could change to thinking of God as the Father, God as the beloved, God as the friend, and so on. But it's that unique way of relationship. And that the purpose is, as I mentioned earlier, what can emerge from the two sides of ourself. You could say the transcendent side and the manifest side. What happens when there's a connecting of these two, but there's not a dissolution of our human side. We don't erase our identity, which is the aim sometimes in Buddhism and yoga. And it's also not like just becoming like this empty shell and there's nothing here but what we think of as God. but there's this uniqueness that arises from being beings by unity. So, the next part of this is there's an amazing amount of realization and discovery and change that can take place just through our own process of awakening. But there's even much more that takes place when we engage in relationships with other people, with nature, with anything for that matter, and we're in this deep state of co-presence. And now there's two different unique aspects of the one being, and the light is interplaying from these two sides, and now a wisdom arises from that could never happen from this part or this part. So if it's two people, like discussions Jonathan and I have, or Diane and I have many discussions, and when we really get cooking, we're having inspirations that neither one of us would have ever thought of on our own, because it's a product of the light of both of us now opening up new ways of perception and conception that couldn't take place. And this is just two. Jesus said, 2 or more are gathered in my name. Well, when 2 or more people are plugged in this way, and multitudes of people are plugged in this way, I believe that there's new possibilities that emerge. And I've believed for a long time this is the only hope for transformation in the world, that the problems humanity's been stuck with for eons, where there's been so many well-meaning people operating from the sense of being separated individuals, even if they're working with other people, feeling they're separated individuals for a common cause. Not that they shouldn't do this, that's great. But if they can feel an alignment of consciousness, what can arise from that is exponentially more than what could happen from people feeling that they're separate. So I did a whole series of classes in the past called Awakening as a Service to Humanity, and I really believe that it is. Most of us start on our spiritual path thinking we're doing this for ourselves, that we want to become enlightened, illuminated, and yes, we want to help make the world a better place, but ultimately, I think we discovered that it's really about the totality awakening to itself, and each of us is a vital, unique part of that. So that would be my response to your question.
It's Margaret Mead. There's a quote by Margaret Mead that says, "Never doubt the potential for a small group of people gathered around an idea to change the world." I'm munching that quote terribly, by the way. I'm missing that quote terribly. But she says, indeed, it's the only thing that ever happens. Like a small group of people dedicated to an idea. It's the only force that has ever changed anything in the whole world.
Yeah. And a little science tidbit I learned about from William Tiller: if you have a group of objects that are in resonance with each other, let's say there's 100, they're resonating, and then you bring one more to put into resonance, you'd think, well, now you're going to have 1/100th more energy coming than you did before. Well, in fact, what happens is if there's 100, the additional contribution from one more is going to be 200 times as much as any single one by itself. That's how much the system has been increased. So think about the millions of people who are praying for peace, who are praying for an end to conflicts in the world, who are paying for an end to racism and all the kinds of oppression, and you just add yourself to that, but you don't think, well, I'm just this one little person, what can I do? But you're really aligning your consciousness, but you're not disappearing in the process. You've got a unique flavor of the light of your being that's added to that. And so now, let's say there's 1 million people doing this, and you add yourself. Now there's the power of that is 2 million times as much as any one person in that group by itself. So, when we hit critical mass and enough people awakening to this way, and it doesn't necessarily have to be through what people think of as spirituality, meditating for a long time. It's just a way of being in the world. I've got some people I work with in our Sufi group that I give spiritual guidance to, and if I had to give a quick essence to what I have to teach them, it is that life is your teacher and life is your practice. That we have numerous opportunities every day to open up possibilities through our way of relating to circumstances that can help to bring about that transformation. Yes?
I know I kind of walked in here, but you were saying that some of what's being said, kind of push-ups in our faith, as far as understanding, struggling with it. And, so listening to you, I'm like, okay. According to Christianity, some of the tenets that is in there, one is broken relationship. Okay, that's where it seems to focus, because original sin is the term. And with quantum physics and all you're saying is, to me, it's saying that relationship's not broken. Even if we believe that we're separated, we still have a fact and connection with everyone.
Yes, well, yeah.
And so what I'm saying is all these terms that I use in my own faith tradition, I'm learning this, I'm like, struggling with, okay, then what do we really mean by these terms that we use in Christianity? Original sin, redemption, and since there wasn't a break in the beginning, it seems. That's what I'm getting.
Okay, well, let me give a little example. Let's pretend you've never seen a computer, and I give you one, and you fumble around, and you figure out how to do word processing. You go, oh, this is neat, I don't have to write it by hand. But you don't realize with this computer, you could experience virtual reality, you could communicate with people on the other side of the world, you could generate beautiful music and so on. All of these were latent possibilities that you didn't even know were there. So instead of thinking in terms of a broken relationship, how about asleep to possibilities that we didn't know were there because of our conditioning, because nobody ever told us, well, actually someone pretty important did tell us this. Jesus said, all that I've done, you can do it and more, but we don't take that to heart. I mean, each of us is a unique manifestation of the divine being, and we could never possibly be separated from that divine being, but we have a unique way of relating to what we think of as God, but we also have a unique way of relating to all the unique expressions of God in the world, in nature, and so on, and the possibilities of what can arise from that are endless. If not being aware of something is a sin, well, maybe we're guilty of that sin, but I don't think it's a sin. We've either forgotten or we didn't know that it was on the menu. And I'm aware that the service is going to start pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole other conversation, and maybe we'll get into this as well, is language, words, and various traditions and how we might get into them again. Thank you so much, Don. This is class 1 of 5, or gathering 1 of 5. We'll see you next week, 9:30 until 10:15. Hope to see you next week.